Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have you today. And Stephanie is going to be just a couple minutes late, so I'm going to kick us off. I think she's on. Oh, there she is. Wonderful. So today's webinar is called Teaching Them to Fish, using ACESTIF to support CCRS instruction. And we're really glad to have you here. I am Christine Kelly, and I'm the Atlas Literacy Coordinator, and I am joined by my fearless colleague, whom I love to present with.
Hello. I am Stephanie Summers, and I am the ACES Coordinator through Atlas. And I also work for Minneapolis Adult Ed, and it's so great to be here with all of you and Christine and Marisa. Oh, I am so sorry. So for our today's agenda, we just have a few different objectives. And we want all of you to be able to identify the connections between basic skills and soft skills instruction. We will look for ways to improve a CCRS aligned lesson by including some more academic supports. And then we're going to reflect on how building ACES skills with learners allows for more rigorous instruction and self-direction. So what we're really thinking about is how teaching those ACES TIF skills provides a lot of support for your learners so that they're able to tackle the more rigorous stuff that is the CCRS. Okay, so we are going to have a few different approaches today. We'll be looking at the ELA strands from the CCRS booklet. And just to remind you, the ELA strands are reading, listening and speaking, writing, and language. So those four groups of standards. We're not going to really be talking about math today. We're going to look at an activity that aligns with each of these strands. And then we'll begin by determining which CCRS standards could be addressed by completing each activity. Okay, after that, we're going to discuss how more standards could be addressed in the lesson by intentionally selecting skills to focus on from ACES TIF. So again, it's going to be how could bringing in these TIF skills help our students to get more out of working on the CCRS standard. Our goal is going to be to help students go deeper with the same materials. And this saves time for the instructors and creates a richer experience for the learners.
Okay, so again, when we talk about the ELA strands, we talk about the reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and language. And as Stephanie said, we're not going to tap directly into language today, but certainly language is part of virtually everything that we do with the reading, writing, speaking, and listening standards. And we're going to be giving you very concrete examples of a reading, a writing, and a speaking and listening task, and then really call out those ACES TIF skills because, and I'm a big proponent of ACES TIF because we know that the CCRS can be complex. We know the standards are rigorous. And without the skills that our students develop or have with ACES TIF, including the critical thinking learning strategies and effective communication, I don't see how our students can do the work of the CCRS without ACES TIF as a foundation. Stephanie, you want to talk about ACES TIF?
I love talking about ACES TIF. Yes. So some of you might be new to ABE in Minnesota, and maybe you are not quite as familiar with all of our acronyms. So ACES stands for Academic, Career, and Employability Skills. And ACES is the name of a homegrown project that started here in Minnesota, actually before the CCRS was rolled out. And so ACES TIF was a way for us to start working on our own set of Minnesota ABE content standards, even before CCRS came down from WIOA in the federal government. So ACES is the name of the project, and TIF was the name of the thing that was developed. And TIF stands for Transition Integration Framework. You can download a copy of the TIF from the Atlas website. And if you look inside, you'll see that it contains 6 categories of some skills that we consider really essential for adult learners. And when this project was developed, we got input from people who work in higher education and the MNSCU system, DEED and workforce partners. And we really wanted to try to identify the different big areas where our adult learners need skills. So some of the 6 categories we ended up with were self-management, developing a future pathway, navigating systems, critical thinking, learning strategies, and effective communication. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And I just like to point out that it's not just like Christine and I and Patsy from Atlas who say that these skills are critical. There was an article published in the most recent edition of the COABE Journal, the spring 2021 workforce edition. And the name of the article was Filling the Soft Skills Gap. And it was by Donna Price and Rana Maggie. And it talked about how adults have skill gaps in 3 important areas. And these gaps can prevent people from getting jobs or from advancing in a current job. And the areas they identified were effective communication, both oral and written, teamwork, and critical thinking. Teamwork is not specifically named in the TIF, but it is part of several other categories like effective communication and some of the other categories as well kind of require teamwork. And that is one of the skills they identified as being really, really essential for adult learners to find success.
And why do we need so many standards? Well, it just seems like we keep layering things on, and our students need them. And we base this, as Stephanie said, again, employers, the research, post-secondary, training organizations, and just community involvement, community or advocacy. We know our students have different gaps, and some of them are academic, some of them are professional skills, and some of them are, of course, digital literacy skills. And I talk a lot about this with teachers, and we know this, that students can have great academic skills, like they can do math really well and be able to read very well. If they don't have some of these, self-monitoring skills, active listening, organization, ability to work collaboratively in groups, that is going to really impact their success on the job and in post-secondary and just in everyday school, like we have all of our adult basic ed learners. So the TIF skills help learners learn and practice strategies that lead to independence. In fact, I was reading an interesting article about teaching a specific writing strategy to GED learners to help them develop persuasive essays. And a key piece of that was, along with the strategy, was teaching the strategy of self-management and self-monitoring, and how crucial that was to students actually being successful in learning how to write stronger persuasive essays. So these things really go hand in hand. And I think that you'll see today, again, with more concrete examples, you'll go, oh my gosh, yeah, I guess I don't think of that as an ACESTIF skill, but I'm doing that. So, and that's always great when you can identify things that you are already doing.
All right, thanks, Christine. What you said about something you've been reading that talks about using self-management skills along with writing instruction just makes me think about how often when our students are really doing their meatiest learning, they are doing integrated instruction. And oftentimes they might be working on a project or some sort of extended writing activity where maybe they're developing an essay and it's going to take some group to come up with a presentation, for example. They might be doing some simple research. And it's really through doing these kinds of integrated tasks where the learners are practicing both academic skills and also their soft skills that we know that the best learning happens. And that's why those are the project-based learning and problem-based learning and integrated and contextualized instruction have been identified as some of the best approaches to use with our adults. So that really rings true to me. If I have my students writing an essay and I expect it's going to take several weeks or a week or two for them to complete it, they're going to need those self-management skills to actually persist in getting it done from the brainstorming stage through drafting and making revisions based on feedback. So I thought it was great that you brought that up. So we're thinking about instructional tasks and how do we determine a goal? So how do we know which standards align with specific tasks? How do we know when an activity that we've planned is going to help our students actually to develop skills towards meeting a standard? One thing we can do is think about our students' goals. Is our student looking for a high school equivalency credential? Do they want to improve their English skills? Are they hoping to be able to participate in a particular way in their community, like go to the doctor without needing a translator, for example? Or maybe they want to get a better job. So one way we can determine what skills our students need to work on is by thinking about their goals. Another thing we can do is think about the level of my students and the academic content that would be appropriate for that level. And then we can look in our CCRS booklet and try to determine the corresponding standards according to whether they're in level A, level B, level C, level D. Another thing that we might do is think about what I want my students to be able to know or do or produce as a result of a lesson. And this is known as backward design. So for example, if I go back to that writing example, if I want my students to write an essay and I have an idea of what I want that final paper to look like, then I can plan backwards to make sure that my students are able to get it just right by recognizing sentence level mistakes, by knowing about the organization and structure that they'll need, and those kinds of things. And then finally, sometimes we might determine which standards or skills we want to focus on just by thinking about our comfort zone as teachers. We all sort of have areas where we feel more comfortable. I am definitely more of a language teacher. I don't feel very confident talking about math, for example. But sometimes it's good for us to move out of our comfort zones in order to meet the needs of our students. And especially, I think, when we're teaching something that causes us to stretch ourselves a little bit, then falling back on looking at the standards can really help to guide us when we're trying to determine what to include in a lesson. All right, Christine, let's dig into the reading now.
Yes, let's talk about academic reading tasks. And again, the way that we're going to work these sections is we're going to take a look at some common tasks in that particular CCRS strand. Then we're going to look at some kind of coordinating or supporting, rather, TIF skills. And then we're going to look at a concrete example, and we're trying to use materials that we use, for example, the change agent Stephanie is going to use. I'm going to use one of the new lessons from North Star that aligns CCRS. And then we're going to have you go into breakout groups, and we're going to have you take a look at choose one from one of the remaining tasks and do a little bit of brainstorming about what the supports are that you could be putting in place to help students do the academic rigor of the standard. So some examples of academic reading tasks. And again, different levels. We try to represent some different levels here. So reading a short text and answering who, what, where, when questions. Orally summarizing or paraphrasing a portion of text. Here, I have to move my videos. So orally summarizing or paraphrasing a portion of text. This could happen at any number of levels. Comparing two texts, print to chart or graph, print to print, print to photograph, photograph to photograph, analyzing a simple argument and determining the author's purpose and point of view. So, and what other ideas? What is a common, let's just take a minute here in the chat box. What is a common academic reading task that you do with your students? As you're thinking of that, a common academic reading task, something that you do that falls under the standards. It might involve vocabulary. It might involve finding the main idea. It might involve now, of course, I'm, looking at the point of view or how the writer feels.
I have one, Christine. So often when I'm reading with my students, we will pause and we will do some oral paraphrasing, or I'll ask my students to identify the main idea of what we just read. And another one that I try to do is, if my students tell me there's a word that they don't understand, whenever possible, I really try to look at the text to see if we can figure it out from context clues. And then I kind of do a think aloud with them to figure out the meaning of that word.
That's a great example. Well, think about that. You certainly can put something in the chat box when I talk briefly about the next slide, and then Stephanie will go through a concrete example. So we called out the CCRS standards for reading here. Anchor 1 involves the close reading and, reading and answering questions. Anchor 2 is what I like to call the summarizing standard. And of course, this involves students working on some level to summarize or paraphrase. Comparing two texts, which is what Stephanie's going to show. This is Anchor 9. And again, we can be comparing any number. It doesn't have to be two long texts. It can be a short piece of text and a visual. Determining effective evidence for an argument is reading Anchor 8, and determining the author's purpose and point of view is 6. And if we look closer at some of the supports here, we have a learning strategy standard, scanning written text for specific information and details. That is the ACESTIF skill that can underlie Anchor 1. The second one, identifying main ideas or themes when reading or listening. This is also a learning strategy, ACESTIF skill. Selecting and using graphic organizers appropriate for a task. This is a learning strategy skill. For determining effective evidence for an argument, we have, sorry, I'm just like blinking here. The categorizing items or ideas and articulating rationale. So whether something's positive versus negative, fact versus opinion, that's a critical thinking ACESTIF. And then determining the author's purpose, identifying and evaluating bias and assumptions of self and others, that is also under critical thinking. And I think that the two columns here really show that idea that the strategies and the skills students need, those kind of more kind of study, thinking, learning skills, are so crucial in order for students to do the work on the left side with the CCRS. Stephanie, why don't you talk about your task?
Yes, I would love to. So first I'll say Rosie. Hi, Rosie. Rosie said in the chat that an academic reading task that she enjoys is comparing photos. Yeah, and so I think one thing that Christine sort of touched on, I believe, was the idea that a text doesn't just have to be made up of, words. It doesn't have to be a bunch of paragraphs on the page, right? A text could be something that we listen to. It could be a video clip. It could even be photos. And what makes it more of a reading activity is the directions that you give to your students around what you want them to do with those photos. So if you're having students compare photos and looking for similarities and differences, and then using academic language to make that comparison, I think that's a great example. Thank you, Rosie. So what you're seeing here is an activity I have done in my writing class. So I have sort of a, I would say it's sort of a pre-GED, some of them are maybe more GED level students in my writing class, and it's a mixed level class. So there are some who are non-native English speakers, along with some who are native English speakers. And this activity I did, I've done more than once with the students, but I started it last fall when I was trying to get the students familiar with journeys. And I was encouraging some of them to maybe write their own stories to submit. So what we did was I picked 2 texts from the book, from the Journeys book, and I picked 2 that were on a similar topic so that it wouldn't be a big stretch to kind of compare them. So you can see the one on the left here was actually written by a student in my writing class. He was in my writing class last year and he'd written this the year before. And he talks about winter weather and when he first came to Minnesota, what it was like for him to live through a Minnesota winter after having lived in Ethiopia his whole life before that. And then on the right, we have kind of a different text that's written more like a poem, but it's also about weather and winter weather in particular. So it's called Snow Season. And so I set up this task for my students. And what I wanted them to be able to do was get at reading anchor 9, which is to compare 2 texts using academic language. And so here are some supporting activities that we did to sort of scaffold up to being able to do the academic comparison. First, we orally made some statements that were true about one or both of the texts. So I would say one of these is a poem, and then the students would tell me which one. One of these is formatted with paragraphs, and they would tell me which one. And so in that way, they were categorizing the statements as being true about the winter weather text or snow season. Then I asked the students just to notice, using a T-chart, 3 details that were true for each of the texts. And so they wrote those in a simple T-chart. And then the next thing that we did was we used those observations and some sentence frames, and they wrote at least one sentence comparing the 2 texts. And so they might say something like, while both texts have the same basic theme, they use different formatting, for example, would be using it into the frame. And something I found is some of my students struggle to use sentence frames because I think they have ideas in their head and the frame has them using language that they're not necessarily familiar with, structures that they're not familiar with. But once we practice it and they get used to it, I find it's something they're able to do pretty easily. So then we wrote some sentences that compared the 2 texts. So a sentence frame blank and blank are similar in that they both talk about winter. However, winter weather focuses on one person's experience coming to Minnesota, while snow season focuses on how the weather makes one feel, for example. And one of the things I like about using these frames is if your students can get used to them, they could use something like this for setting up an introduction to a GED style argument where they have to talk about 2 texts. And so if they can get used to referring to texts by their titles, for example, then that is a skill that hopefully they can transfer over to the GED. The other frame was, although both authors write about winter, these two texts are different because of the formatting, for example, or the purpose. One of the texts is sort of to inform, the other one I think is more to entertain, the snow season text. So here is an example of how using our ACES-TIF skills, such as categorizing for critical thinking, also using the T-chart would be an example of that categorizing and critical thinking. And then being able to use the frame, I think, is related to effective communication so that students get used to using that academic language. All right, that is my example. So I think Christine's going to give some directions for our, I'm going to give some directions for our first breakout room. I am sorry. I can't follow my own notes here today. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have students, we're going to have you participants, you wonderful, wonderful participants, go into some breakout rooms. So on the screen, on the left side of the screen, there are 5 different anchor standards from the CCRS. The one comparing to text, which is anchor 9, that was our example or our model. So we're not going to use that one in the breakout room. When you go into your breakout room, you're going to choose one of the 4 remaining anchor standards to discuss with your group. What you're going to basically be doing is you're going to choose a standard, and then you're going to think of 1 or 2 tasks that your students could do to practice these skills in order to meet the standard. And so we have the ACES-TIF skills on the right side of the slide, the CCRS skills on the left side of the slide. And we're hoping that you'll think about how using the ACES skills will help your students to meet the academic standard from the CCRS. We are going to put you into some breakout rooms, and we're going to chat out for you a note-taking scaffold that you'll be able to use in your breakout room. Okay. And then we are going to be in our breakout rooms for about 10 minutes this first time. Christine has just chatted out the link. So you will go into a breakout room. You'll be with probably 1 or 2 other people. The directions and a picture of this slide are on that note-taking form. You can spend a couple minutes introducing yourselves, and then we're asking for 1 person to be a note taker. And the reason we gave you the note-taking form was so that you could capture any ideas that come out of your group brainstorming session. And then you'll be able to have these notes after the webinar today. And we're hoping that you can refer back to them maybe the next time you are doing some lesson planning. All right, so is that about everything, Christine, or is that?
I think so.
Okay, perfect.
All right, well, I'm going to pause the recording here.
I thank you, Laura, for your little note. And please, I always tell people this, students rule, right? I never want to be someone who is too busy doing something to work with a student. So thank you for working on something with a student. That's important. You can go back and always watch the webinar. So I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie, and she's going to talk a little bit about academic writing.
Yes, so before I launched into academic writing, I was able to come into your breakout rooms. So I kind of heard what people were talking about. But if there's anything that you talked about that you thought was interesting that you wanted to share, we could certainly put that in the chat. So I know one of the groups was talking about paraphrasing skills. That was the anchor standard that they wanted to focus on. And when I was in the other group, I think they were kind of deciding which skill to talk about. But if you'd like to share anything from your discussions, we'd love to have you use the chat, and we invite you to use that. But we will also move on because we want to be mindful of your time. And so we'll talk about the next ELA strand, which is writing. And we'll talk about some examples of academic writing tasks. And so one example would be respond to a text with an opinion and several reasons that support the opinion. We could also write a short narrative sequencing events logically and using some descriptive details, right? So in a lower level class, this could just be simply writing about what I do to get ready in the morning, right? Or maybe in the evening at my house, what are some of the things that happen? Construct an email message to 3 different audiences, paying attention to formality of language. So we know that register and tone are so important, and we need to help our students recognize different levels of formality. So when something is, when a very formal tone is required and when we can be less formal. Create an objective summary of a text collaboratively in a Google Doc where other groups can comment. So maybe in a class, if you've read a text together and then everyone gets a document, sort of like you did today in your small groups, you could work together to write a summary, and then groups could sort of collaborate to add or take things out until it's a finished piece of work. And then evaluate the credibility of several online sources for use in an informational essay. We know that those information literacy skills are so important, and it's really, really valuable for our students to be able to identify what is a valid source from what is a less valid source. So these are some ideas that we came up with. If there's anything that you think we missed, we would love to have you add that to the chat. And then here are some examples of academic tasks that come from the CCRS. Respond to a text with an opinion and several reasons that support the opinion. Write a short narrative sequencing events logically and using some descriptive details. Construct an email message to 3 different audiences. Create an objective summary. So these are pretty much the same as what we already saw. And that's on the left side of your slide. On the right side, we see how some ACES-TIF skills might support the CCRS work. So for Anchor 1, we could support positions using prior knowledge and supporting evidence, and that's critical thinking. Sequence ideas in a logical or structured manner for creating that narrative would also be critical thinking. Choose appropriate register for audience, purpose, and communication type. That would be effective communication. Participate, make contributions, and encourage the contributions of others. That is that teamwork, and that comes from effective communication. And evaluate the quality and validity of information. That is critical thinking. So one thing I want to point out really quickly before Christine takes over is just how beautifully these different sets of standards work together and blend together. And that means that if you plan a lesson around that idea of writing an email, for example, just by design, you are going to be hitting on different sets of standards. And that is really standards integration at its best. So Christine, why don't you show us your writing example?
Yes, some of you may have heard that Leah Hauge, amazing writer of North Star curriculum, and I have collaborated, and I have worked with her to support her in creating a CCRS English Language Arts aligned project for each of the current 12 modules of the North Star curriculum. And this is a sneak peek if you haven't seen it. And I decided it would be great to use something from the North Star curriculum because many people use it or will be using these additional projects. and this is to evaluate the credibility of several online sources. So this is actually from the unit Internet Basics, which some of you may be familiar with the regular curriculum and testing students with that. But this is now a CCRS aligned unit project. And these are available for free in Minnesota, along with the North Star curriculum. I believe you need to contact your program manager or the North Star person, main or key North Star person in your program to find out how to get them. But so the task here is to find 4 online sources that answer a research question, or it doesn't have to be research. It could be just an interesting question, like where are, the best Italian restaurants around? I think of all the ways that students can do research or develop skills that aren't necessarily, you will then write an argument analysis. I mean, research skills can be developed in lots of different ways. But the key here is to evaluate if each website is reliable or less reliable, and then explain the reasoning. And when you see here this great graphic organizer that Leah created, it is a nice way for students to go through and determine for each characteristic if the website seems reliable or if it might have misinformation, and then to make for 4 sites, and then to make a decision, yes or no, and then to write a statement about why each website is reliable or less reliable. So I took this, and when we look at ACESTIF, we have a learning strategy skill about identifying online sources. So this idea of doing that and looking for bias, looking for reliability, we've got a chart here which aligns with learning strategies again. It's because it's a great way to use a specific graphic organizer for students to organize their information. And then using sentence frames and transitional words or phrases for language support to summarize the conclusion. I actually took it one step further, sorry. And I would ask students, or I would give them a sentence frame and ask them to go one step beyond whether it's reliable or less reliable. So the sentence frame, website, whichever one, is reliable or less reliable because blank, and that follows the information here with the graphic organizer below the chart. However, I added something additional, and that is a specific example to support my conclusion is. So whether it was, I thought there was a lot of opinion, a specific example to support my conclusion is the website looked professional, but I'm not sure who, I couldn't tell who was behind it. There was no date. A specific example to support my conclusion is the purpose seemed to sell something. So I thought that would be one additional step to help students do that. And I like this because this is something that we can do. We could use this. I would use this in my GED class. Now, the North Star curriculum is geared for more of an intermediate level student. I would totally use this with my GED or diploma students as a start to getting them to think about evaluating the resources that they're using. And Stephanie's right for the GED, but some of you may be hearing rumblings of the high set that we are adding as another option. And the difference between the high set and the GED is that there's a separate writing test now. It's not going to just be reading and writing all in one test. And it's going to be really important that students score on that essay. So, but certainly research can be done at most of the levels of our students, and really getting them to look at what they're doing. It's a really relevant activity, and we've got such great curriculum that Leah has been working hard on developing. So your turn. We're going to go back into the very same groups, and I wasn't able to jump in to the groups this last time, but I am going to jump in and just listen in a little bit on what you decide to choose. Again, the one in bold, evaluate the credibility. That's the one that we just looked at. And if you want to choose another one, and then think about, again, what are some tasks that students could do to practice the skills needed to meet that standard. This time we're only going to do 8 minutes instead of 10 because we gave you a little extra time to introduce yourselves. Stephanie, anything to add that I missed?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I just wanted to say, I felt a little bit when I visited the breakout rooms, like maybe people were putting too much pressure on themselves with our directions. You don't have to develop a full task.
No.
It would be enough to talk about how you might support your students working up to one of these more rigorous anchor standards in your class. So just what are some activities that you have found useful when you want your students ultimately to be able to do one of these things? I think that might be a better way of thinking about what we want you to do.
Right, that's a great clarification. Thank you, Stephanie.
How did it go that time? I hope that you maybe were able to slip into the activity just a little bit more easily. Christine, did you notice any highlight when you were visiting rooms?
No, it was just great. I ended up just being in the one room. That time went by really fast, but one of the participants in that room, I think it was, I'm so bad with names, Rachel, I think. It was Rachel. Yes. She talked about how she and another person on the webinar here, Karen, are in the ABE certificate program right now at Hamlin, and how that task about learning, kind of working with the formality and writing different emails was one that she recently did for class. And we talked a little bit about some supports that she included.
Oh, that sounds great. Very cool. And if you talked about something and you were in the other breakout room, we would love to have you add that to the chat, or even if you'd like to unmute if you were in the other breakout room and share an idea, that would be great. This webinar is, I know, just a little bit different. Rather than sharing a lot of resources or throwing a lot of like lesson ideas at you, we really wanted to give some examples of what it looks like when the standards, these two sets of standards, work together. And then we wanted you to spend some time connecting with your colleagues, kind of sharing some ideas. So we do appreciate you participating in the breakout rooms.
And if I could add one thing to that, Stephanie, before you talk about these final tasks, we want to show concrete examples because, we read evaluations really closely. So when we ask for evaluations on webinars, at conferences, study circles, we sit down and we read them all. And one of the things that's been coming up a lot is it's great to hear that, for example, these standards, easily kind of weave together, but more examples, please, of what that looks like. And so it's like, of course, yeah, we often, ACES, TIF, and CCRS, they go great together. Next, we're going to talk about, but it's like, yeah, okay, so what, some people just see that right away, and some people need to see some concrete examples to go, oh my gosh, yeah, okay, I'm actually doing that. So that this was in direct response, and what we hope to do more of in the future in conference sessions and webinars is to show real concrete examples. And also we hope to start including more student work so that you can actually see things in action. So.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Christine. I sometimes feel when I am presenting in a webinar, it's just bang, 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 bang. Here's a resource. Here's a website. Check out this link. You'll find this downloadable activity good to use in your class. And I think it gets so overwhelming. So people walk away with maybe some new resources, but possibly not as much time to reflect and talk with colleagues about the integration piece. So that's sort of why we structured this webinar a little differently. All right, we are going to move on. So one thing I want to say is we are not doing a separate activity for language. So if you've been paying attention, we did talk about 4 ELA strands, and we sort of combined the writing and language standards just for time today. So we're going to go ahead and skip to examples of academic speaking and listening tasks. And so these some examples that Christine and I came up with were listening for a specific purpose, like main idea, key details, and inference. Again, using the appropriate register and tone, but this time when speaking. Identify a speaker's point of view and how the point of view impacts the speaker's message. And then incorporating multimedia components like graphics, videos, audio clips, etc., into an oral presentation, and engaging in a collaborative discussion to complete a task. So these are some examples of the academic tasks. And on the next slide, we'll see how these tasks could be supported maybe with some ACES TIF work. So for Anchor 2, about listening for a specific purpose, from the learning strategies category, we have identified main ideas or themes when reading or listening. Again, when we're talking about register and tone, that's effective communication. In the TIF, effective communication covers both oral and written communication. Identify a speaker's point of view would align with recognize a speaker or writer's intent or purpose, which is one of the critical thinking skills. Incorporating different multimedia components would align with evaluate and use appropriate technology tools for clear, and meaningful interactions to suit purpose and audience. Again, under effective communication. And then the one we're going to highlight here, engaging in a collaborative discussion to complete a task, aligns with participate, make contributions, and encourage the contributions of others in order to accomplish the shared goal of a team. And again, we have that magic word teamwork, which we know is one of the 3 skill gap areas that was identified in that study that came out of that COABE article. So Christine, let's look at your examples.
Yes. So I spend a lot of time thinking about Anchor 1 in the speaking and listening standards, because collaborative discussion is different than just discussion, right? And collaborative discussion requires all sorts of skills in order to talk together, clarify ideas, build on ideas, disagree respectfully, be able to say to someone, oh, so I think what I hear you saying is blank. And so there's lots of skills involved with collaborative discussion. And this is something that I built on. It is conversation groups from the great Jessica Jones, who works for Literacy Minnesota. This conversation group model, and then I added some talk moves and some writing to it. I know teachers who use this at with lower levels of students when they're just practicing, conversation. I know teachers who use this at the GED diploma level to engage in a collaborative discussion. In that case, they may do more conversational questions, or they may work with questions about a text or about the content that the students have been working on. So the task is to participate in a conversation circle where everyone has a specific role. And then I took it another step, which is to report to the larger group key ideas from the conversation. So this here with the conversation groups is something that Jessica had made up. You can put it on a table and everybody sits at a spot. If, of course, you're able to do this live. I know people who have done this also virtually in breakout rooms. And then you can just, rotate it, and then everyone's roles change after one question. So the supporting activity is, well, first we have the questions. I grabbed these from conversation questions for the ESL, EFL classroom. This is, the website is there. There's so many questions about all kinds of things in life. So It's a great website to pull just to get students talking about all kinds of like adult topics. And this was, do you think stress is ever good, useful, or necessary? Okay, so then the first person chooses a question. If you give them 5 or 6 questions, reads it out loud. The second person answers the question. The third person summarizes the answer that he or she just heard. And the fourth person asks a follow-up question, whatever they choose to do. So I took it one step further, and I created these talk moves cards to support students who are doing numbers 2, 3, and 4, answering the questions, summarizing, and then asking a follow-up question to give them some language support to be able to engage in these roles. And yes, and I also have lots of, I also am happy to share any of this with anyone. I'm sorry, but I went too far here. So then use a sentence stems provided, report key ideas. So I added a summarizing piece to this. So it's also, that's the listening part. Like, you know, you need to be listening and you need to decide as a group then what were some of the key ideas and then report out to the larger group. And so I created these sentence frames and asking students to report using 2 of these sentence frames. So they're going to orally report about, we decided, agreed that, we disagreed, we concluded that, the group's opinion is. So there's a little bit of presenting of information here as well. And again, it is, it's something that students can just do the conversation group and sit at each spot and just have conversations. You can further support the development of academic language and collaborative discussion by adding talk moves and then adding a piece where they have to bring forward some key ideas like we do all the time ourselves in webinars. Thank you, Marisa, for that. So last time, and we're going to keep an eye here on the time to make sure, I think we're going to be able to wrap up everything perfectly today. So back to the note-taking form that Marisa put in there. And again, listening for a specific purpose, using appropriate register and tone, identifying a speaker's point of view and the impact that that point of view has. Putting on oral presentations and including certain graphics, clip art, videos, other pictures and things, charts and graphs, any of that. What are a couple tasks, 1 or 2 tasks that if your students were going to do one of these tasks, could you put in place to help them develop some of those kind of foundational or underlying skills to meet that standard?
All right, thank you. I think Christina and I totally recognize that when you're in a smaller group, I mean, the pressure, maybe there's more pressure to participate, but we, and maybe there's a greater desire to drop out. And we appreciate you sticking with us for our 3 rounds of breakout rooms.
Can we start recording, Marisa?
We are recording.
Oh, I didn't get the recording message. So couple things here, just wrapping up here. I created this a while ago before I went and did North Regional, back when we actually had the different regionals before COVID. This was my handy ACES reference. And this was for teachers who were like, oh, how do I incorporate ACES? And I said, look, are students participating in groups? Are you working on appropriate register? Are you teaching them and helping them ask for clarification? Are they doing any predicting? Are they tapping into background knowledge? Are they working with main ideas or themes? Are they being metacognitive about their progress? Are they making inferences? Are they using context clues, graphic organizers? Are they doing anything by putting things into categories, summarizing, note-taking? Again, clarification, any gap fill activities where they have to fill in information, any synthesizing of multiple pieces of information or just a couple, sequencing, anything with argument, problem solving, evaluating the info that they're reading, whether it's, a website or not, and looking at the different perspectives and looking to see if there's bias. if you're doing any of these things, you're doing ACESTIF in the classroom. So just keep in mind that there's so many things that we do that we know is good teaching, right? And we do things and they are really, and just even being even more intentional, these are really important supports for our students to do the work of the Blue Book, of the CCRS. And also, if you want to quickly think about, I'm watching the timer, the shifts. These are great questions as far as where, when are students engaging with complex text? How are students working with academic or high utility vocabulary? How much are they working with it? How am I asking students to use evidence? Point to it in a picture, say it from a line 10, this is the evidence, or knowledge. How are you using informational text? Are you using 2 or 3? Are you building knowledge of particular content? And again, are you using multiple texts? And how are you asking students to demonstrate the knowledge? And you might be giving them choices in how to demonstrate the knowledge when they're speaking, like give a few key ideas from your group, the conversation group that we looked at, that's a way of demonstrating knowledge when they're speaking. So there's some kind of down and dirty things we can look at that kind of keep our eye on the ball, basically. Stephanie?
Yeah, so this is just to show us, and as a reminder, you probably know this, but again, we never know if someone's going to be new to ABE. There are 2 online courses, both available through Schoology, that help to, that were created to sort of deepen your understanding of both of these sets of standards. So there's the CCRS Foundations course online that's facilitated by Christine and Lindsay, and the access code you can see there. And then the ACES TIF course I facilitate, also available online. And we know that Schoology has changed and that there's not free teacher accounts anymore. But if you join one of these courses, you are joining as a participant or a student. So that should still be free for you.
Yes, it is.
All right, and we can move on and we'll talk about.
Yeah, so quickly, and Marisa is putting some links in the chat box. This looks a little different because our website has been revamped and we have a new logo, which is really exciting for us. Content Standards Resource Library. There's lots of resources here. And on the right side, that's if you pull, use the pull down menus. Lots of great examples. This is where we have links to the videos under English Learners and CCRS that we did with Literacy Minnesota that shows 4 different levels of ESL and exact Minnesota ABE teachers implementing the standards, the CCRS standards. There's models of lesson plans. There's all kinds of things here. And so we really encourage you, or I really encourage you, to dig around in there and see what you can find. And there's also another cool resource library. There are a lot of them, but an ACESTIF specifically.
Yes, so the ACES Resource Library, again, kind of redesigned thanks to Marisa's website magic. So you can download the TIF here. If you think back to when we rolled out ACES, like in 2014, we developed some videos and some sample lesson plans. Those sample lesson plans are still available. So if any of the TIF categories, you could download a sample lesson plan that walks you through how to teach a lesson that's really rich in these skills at 3 levels of instruction. So I think that's a great thing to maybe come back to every once in a while. And then each of the category specific sections of the resource library has resources, links to websites or curriculum materials that have been developed and would support the development of the skills within, or the sub-skills and skills within each category. So just a good reminder that these resources exist.
I'd like to thank everybody. And if you think this would be useful to colleagues, we will, of course, be posting it on the Minnesota YouTube channel. And if you have any questions about it, go ahead and email me or Stephanie. If you have any questions about the examples, please do so. I'm going to close by, yes, I'm here in my office. And by the way, YouTube has wonderful videos with soft music and just, I have the burning fireplace here on my other monitor. It's very relaxing with classical music. And so with that, now I feel like I'm on Masterpiece Theater. Thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. We were a small but active group of people on this webinar today, and I will make sure that this gets shared in Mighty Networks, in the ACES group, for example, and do reach out if you have any questions at all. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And if you have suggestions for future webinars, be sure to share that on the evals that Marisa has chatted out a link to. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.